Hey, everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today my guest is a comedian, and you may have heard him before as the co host of an amazing podcast called Horse. Please welcome Adam Mamawala to the podcast.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing well.
I am very excited to have you on today because we previously had your co-host Mike on the podcast, and he also talked about a comedian and his experience with that. So I'm excited to see kind of how your experience is as well.
Cool. Yeah,
Uh,
he talked about Bo Burnham, right?
he did. He talked about seeing Bo Burnham live for the first time. And then when
Nice.
you also chose a comedy special, I was like, that makes sense. That'll work.
Yeah.
um, Yeah. So what's the thing we're talking about today? What's your piece of media that changed your life?
We're gonna talk about Russell Peters' Comedy Now special, which came out in 2004 and was one of kind of the first like viral things I remember. This was like the very early days of YouTube. And it just sort of exploded and made the rounds and to some degree made his entire career.
Yeah, I was really glad it was on YouTube when you sent it over to me so I could actually watch it and see it. And I
Yeah.
remembered seeing clips. Like I remembered
Hmm.
some of the jokes, but I don't think I had ever watched the whole special start to finish before.
Right.
Do you remember so you said it was 2004. Do you remember the first time you saw the special?
I don't remember exactly when it was. I mean, I was a junior in high school at that time, and I remember it was kind of like making the rounds. And also, so Russell Peters is Indian. He's grew up in Canada, but he's Indian. And so like amongst the Indian people that I knew, there just started to be this rumbling of like, oh, have you heard this comedy special? And it had this kind of like it's kind of a lost era now, but when it was harder to access things, there was this buzz around like, oh, how do I figure out how to listen to this? And I remember someone I think burned just the audio of it on a CD for me. And
Mm.
so I think I heard it before I ever saw the special. Um, but the most distinct memory I have at that time was that I all of a sudden, once I heard it, became the person who was sharing it with everybody that I knew. And then it started to kind of make its way around my high school a little bit. And also, I was a tennis player and I remember being on a tennis trip and I convinced our coach to let us like put it on in the car on some road trip. Because I mean, there are parts of it that are a bit inappropriate, but like I figured I could get away with it. And other
Sure,
than a
yeah.
few parts, he was like, "Yeah, this is really funny." So I felt it was this cool thing where I felt like I was part of this club that nobody was a part of yet. And now, if you fast forward it, I mean, Russell Peters he's weirdly not that huge in the US, but he'll sell
Mhm.
out like football stadiums. Like he'll sell out Wembley Stadium in
Yeah.
London doing comedy shows.
Yeah, he's huge, I feel like, and especially with, like, how much wider the internet has gotten at this point, I feel like
Sure.
I see him far more often than I used to, um,
Yeah.
like, clips on TikTok and those kinds of things, but he's a household name.
He definitely is. And it was a cool story with him because he was a guy who was like, a working road comic and I
Mm.
think was getting by, but all of a sudden this special was released and they put it online in an era where there just wasn't as much stuff out there and it absolutely exploded. And overnight he went from being a guy who was like probably getting paid $1,000 for a weekend if he was lucky to doing like arenas.
Yeah, it was really, like, 2004, I feel like was really early stages of YouTube when things were
Yeah, for
starting.
sure.
Yeah. I I like how you described it almost like this sort of, like, underground, passing of a
Yeah.
holy book, you know what I mean? You're like, "I'm gonna record it and share it with everyone I know individually." Um,
Well, it reminded me. I don't know if we were talking before we started recording about our shared love of basketball, and I don't know if you've seen the documentary on Netflix about the And One mixtape, but like,
yeah,
it was that sort of thing where when that came out, it was this commodity where people were like, "Oh, how do I get my hands on this? What do I do to get a DVD? Can someone like pirate it for me?"
yeah.
And now it just wouldn't even occur to anyone to do that when you can just snap your fingers and listen to or watch anything you could ever conceive of. But at that time, there was something cool about feeling like you had access to something that not everybody knew about.
Yeah, yeah, the And One mixtape is such a I think And One in general is such a good, reference point for that too, because 'cause I'm sure
Mhm.
people listening are also like, "What is And One?"
Yeah.
Still to this day, which I remember growing up and watching And One and thinking it was the coolest thing in the
Oh
world.
my god, yeah.
And just amazing. Basketball with no rules. Like, just do what you want, as many tricks as you want. And at one point I remember being like, "I just think the NBA should play this way." Like, "Okay,
Yeah,
sure."
yeah, but you know what? The kind of takeaway of the documentary was like, yeah, it kind of flamed out and didn't sustain its success, but if you look at modern basketball, it is way flashier than it was 20 or 30 years ago, and I think there's definitely a correlation between that mixtape getting the popularity it did and some of that being incorporated into the NBA, just, like, not with quite as much flair or, like,
Yeah.
crossing someone over and then throwing the ball 30 rows into the stands, but
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not as far, but still very much yeah, you're right. I think there's so much more flashiness than there used to be, with that, so
yeah.
it's very fun. Um, so you were a junior in high school,
Mhm.
and, also you mentioned playing tennis. Were you in any way, like, exploring being funny as something that you wanted to do in life?
I think I was, like, being funny in my day-to-day life.
Yeah.
I was not entertaining the idea of one day being a comedian professionally. So I was one of those people both in high school and college where I was just involved in a lot of different things. So I don't know that I had, like, a singular identity of, like, "Oh, that's the comedy guy," or "That's the tennis guy," or whatever, which I'm glad that I was kind of well-rounded in that way where I had a lot of different groups that I hung in. So I was performing at that time, but not at all in a comedy context. I was
Mhm.
doing, music. I was, like, in choir and, musicals and doing theater and stuff like that. So, whenever people ask, like, what the origin is of me doing stand-up, I always say it definitely has something to do with getting comfortable being in front of people, even
Mhm.
when I wasn't doing it as a comedian. Like, just the feeling of standing on a stage and having that not be nerve-wracking. I feel like was something that had come pretty naturally to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's such a good point. I was just talking to, a couple of other, voice actors the other day
Mhm.
about stand-up, and both of them are comfortable doing improv, but when they talk about
Yeah.
stand-up, they were like, "I just think it's the scariest thing in the history of the world." Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's interesting that you talk about choir or talk about kind of tennis is a performance of sorts as well, having to be
Mhm.
able to perform in front of a group. Um, and you talk about that in a way that prepares you to be able to do stand up, which I think both of those are things that are a little solo. Like you have to you would be part of a group or part of a team, but tennis is a pretty individual sport as well.
Yeah, and that's been brought to my attention before, and I never thought about it consciously, but it's interesting that the sport that I was best at is a fairly individualistic kind of sport. Now, in fairness, I did actually play doubles. I played more doubles than I played singles, and I still feel like I was part of a team in a collaborative way. But yeah, tennis and basketball were my sports growing up. But yeah, it's an interesting point. Sorry, you can. I lost my train of thought, but
No, it's
feel free to pick it
um,
up for me if you find it.
but no, I think I just think it's interesting. Like sometimes I think there's people think about like being funny in a certain type of way, right? Like improv
Right.
is fine, but it's team sports. There's someone else who can sort of pick it up if I drop
Mhm.
it to some degree. Versus stand up, like there's if you forget it.
Right. it's so interesting that you bring it up that way because that's when you said that you know improv people who find stand up scary. I thought about it from a completely different standpoint, which is that to me, part of the reason that stand up is not scary, other than doing it a thousand times, is that I know what I'm going to do.
Yeah,
Like there's an element of preparedness that I have because I can sit down and write a set list and I know what the plan is. Improv to me is terrifying because you don't know what's going to happen. So
yeah.
yes, you can rely on other people to some degree, but I guess maybe it's just a matter of preference. But to me, that feels scarier. But also, I'm sure it's a matter of reps, right? If you're working at Second City or Groundlings or wherever, and you're doing improv 5 nights a week, then I'm sure it becomes as unintimidating as me doing stand up is.
I did improv for, like, 3 years pretty consistently, and it never got less scary.
Yeah,
It was very fun, but it never got less scary in
right.
terms of that, ability. Before you watched this special, were you aware of stand-up as, like, a junior in high school, were you listening to other stand-up comedians or watching other ones?
It was right around the time that I started to get into stand-up.
Okay.
Like, I was always exposed to a lot of comedy, but not a lot of stand-up, if that makes any sense. Like, my parents were always into comedy, so whether it was, like, watching super old school, like, Laurel and Hardy and Charlie
Yeah.
Chaplin movies when I was a little kid and I Love Lucy and all that stuff to then I feel like if we were to watch a movie as a family, it would often be some sort of comedic movie. Like, my parents were they had a great sense of humor, so I was exposed to a lot of stuff, but stand-up wise, first of all, it was a little hard to find, like, unless you were gonna stay up late and watch Letterman or something like that, it wasn't that easy to find. Once Comedy Central started to take off, I do remember watching a lot of those, like, half-hour specials, like the Comedy Central Presents and, Premium Blend at that time, which was like a kind of a showcase style show that they've had iterations of. Like, it went from, like, Premium Blend to Live at Gotham and Adam Devine's House Party and all these at any given moment, Comedy Central will have some sort of, like, shorter form stand-up thing, but long way of saying that at the time, I was really just becoming familiar with stand-up. Like, other than incredibly famous people like, Jerry Seinfeld or, I remember at that time, that's when Chappelle's Show was getting huge, so, like,
Mhm.
becoming obsessed with that show and then looking into all of Chappelle's stand-up, but I remember the Russell Peters special feeling, like, distinctly different to me. I think particularly because I am, half Indian and that special, like, speaking to, an experience that I had not heard talked about in stand-up.
Yeah, I think also now it's so easy to forget how infrequent stand-up was to, like,
Mhm.
the general community because now Netflix has just every stand-up comedian under the sun that you could think of has, seems to have an hour, like, or half an hour or
And forget
15
Netflix,
minutes.
I mean, just go on Instagram for 5 minutes.
Exactly, it's just so accessible now,
Yeah,
whereas at that time, it is sort of this kind of, like, you either had to stay up late, and sort of past your bedtime and, like, it's like a little, little secret thing that you're watching or kind of try to find it, but you're right, like, it was kind of one of the first ones that YouTube was starting to allow that accessibility that has turned into the extreme accessibility that we have
right,
now.
right.
Yeah. I like that you talked about, like, it was the first time you had heard some of your own experiences or some
Mhm.
similar experiences to your own in the special. Is that something that maybe sparked the idea of my experiences could be funny this way too for you?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure, and when I started doing stand-up, which was, a few years later, is when I was a freshman in college, at that time, I still was doing a lot of, like, I don't know if corny is like, too being too mean, to myself, but, like, certainly a lot of stuff that was low-hanging fruit or more, like,
sure.
observational or even impressions and stuff like that, but, yeah, hearing Russell Peters talk about his experience, especially, like, his experience with his family, I
Mhm.
think that kind of personal material very much informs, like, the kind of comedy I do now. It took me a while to get there, and I think part of that is also, like, what frame of reference do you have for life as an 18-year-old? Like, what are you really gonna be talking about on stage that is of so much importance?
Yeah.
Anytime you hear, like, a really young comedian and they have a defined point of view, I find that incredibly impressive because it's like, I can't speak for anyone else, but until I was about in my late 20s, I don't really know that I had anything that interesting to say.
Yeah, it's this conversation is giving me flashbacks to when I started comedy in college as well,
Yeah.
because I I took a stand-up class, which, my college offered, which is,
Where did you go to college?
I went to Emerson, and
Of
in
course,
Boston.
Emerson did.
Yeah,
Yeah, of
yeah,
course.
they have a comedy major now,
Oh my
which
god.
to me is so distressing, and it started basically when they put it in, it was like I was 1 year behind where you could have gotten it, and they were like everybody was like, "Oh, man, we could have gotten a comedy." I was like, "No one needs a degree in comedy, guys, like, that's
Yeah. Well,
embarrassing.
back
How
in
are
my
you"
day, we just used to call that a degree in communications.
Yeah. I was like, "How are you gonna put that on a resume?" Like,
Oh
good
my
luck,
god.
like, ugh, but they did have a stand-up comedy class, and I was like, "Whatever," and
Mhm.
so I ended up in a class of 14 aspiring college comedians,
Yeah.
uh, and 13 of them, besides myself, were, just white guys, so
Mhm.
it was one of those things where you sat in a room all day. And I'm glad I took the class. I don't think I would have started doing stand-up if it weren't for the class. But I do remember sitting around and being like, all of the guys were very nice. It's not anything like that. And I hopefully nobody takes this personally, but I just remember sitting and being like, everybody is making the exact same joke and nobody wants to hear that joke. Um, it's
Right.
just the same point of view over and over. And like you're saying, it is like, what do you have to talk about that? Like, yes, we
Right.
get it. The floor is sticky in Alston. Like it was so fascinating. But finding that point of view, I think, or I guess putting my own point of view against sort of a group point of view helped me find my own. And it sounds like you sort of had, not in the same way, but you had a more positive version of that, of watching someone have their own point of view that was different from what you had been hearing and realizing that perhaps you have a similar point of view, if not the same.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, and I mean, your description of that experience at Emerson, it frankly sounds like a ton of open mics that I went
Mm,
to in my early days in New York, especially before there was, I would say, like, a little more inclusion within comedy, and it's not
sure.
as if there's anyone at the door saying, like, "You can come in, you can't come in," but just in terms of, like, the people that comedy attracted, and I've heard this from many, 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 women in comedy that I know that, like, it was a very isolating, and, like, unwelcoming experience, I
Yeah.
think specifically to women, but also to, like, people of color in general, and again, it wasn't anyone, like, keeping them out, it was just that it did tend to be that demographic, and I think that also contributed to the kind of comedy that I do now, which is that, any given moment when there's something happening in the media or in the world, everybody's gonna have a take on it, right? And we see this more than ever now with Twitter and, like, everyone just having their opinion out there all the time. But if that's your angle, your version of that take is gonna have to be really good for it to stand out.
Mm, yeah.
Whereas if I'm just talking about my life and my own experience, literally no one else has ever lived that specifically.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a better thing for me to talk about. Now, sure, are there things that I say that other people will be like, "Oh, yes, I have also experienced something similar." Yes, but no other person in the history of humankind has lived my exact life, so I might as well talk about it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think political comedy and um sort of like one-liners or jokes that would go in a
Mhm.
monologue on SNL, that's great and it's a specific skill, but I always preferred listening to people who kind of pick that personal point of view of here's
Totally.
what my life is and here's why it's funny.
Yeah, if I listen to a comic, even if they're a great joke writer, if I get done listening and I'm like, I have no sense of who this person is, I don't like it that much.
Agreed, yeah, and I think, it's interesting too because 'cause I've listened to some comedians talk about, like, everything I say on stage is not true.
Mhm.
It's a story, but it's still I think the best comedians, even if they're telling you a complete lie, it still makes you feel like, "I left knowing this person a little bit better."
Yeah, I agree, and also, like, unless you're a completely over the top, like, absurdist comedian and what you're talking about is, like, clearly something that is not true because it involves you, like, being abducted by aliens,
Yeah.
um, I always prefer when the thing is at least, like, based in reality because it takes me out of it when it's like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, right? Like, if someone tries to pass something off as being a true story and it is so outlandish that you're positive that they made it up, I
Mhm.
feel like it immediately impacts their credibility as I'm listening to the rest of the set because I'm just waiting for them to, like, undermine their own story
Yeah.
and admit that it's all a lie.
The all fake, yeah, I agree with
Yeah.
that. It's like, you're waiting for the punchline of, "And then I woke up," and, it's the dream sequence in TV.
Yeah, like, don't I
Yeah.
feel like I'm being, like, tricked into caring about what you're saying only to be embarrassed at the end of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, there's something very enjoyable about sort of I'm the joke or my experience is the joke. It's self-deprecating and enjoyable, which brings you sort of off the it's weird to say off the pedestal because you are quite literally on a pedestal on on stage telling
Yeah,
jokes, but it puts
yeah.
you on a level playing field of, like, you guys can sit there, not be you can be faceless and you can laugh at this thing that happened to me or laugh at this experience that I have, which
Right.
I think has a version of, like, performance that or has a version of relatability that other performances don't or
Mhm.
performance types don't have.
Right.
Um, so, yeah, I don't know. We like stand-up, it sounds like we
Yeah.
love
Yeah,
jokes.
yeah, yeah. No, I love it.
Um, yeah. So when you were sharing this, when you were sharing Russell Peters' special with your
Mhm.
friends, did you get the, like the response that you wanted? Did you guys start kind of riffing on the same jokes and doing that thing? Did people like it as much as you did?
Yeah, yeah, and I've had this with various things, whether it's movies or other pieces of media over the years, where like you love something so much that you know it front to back, you can recite every word of it, but you're so excited to listen to it or watch it with someone for the first time because then you get to see their reaction to it. Like there's such a thrill to that. And to a fault, like I feel like if you were to ask my friends in college, like I was the person who, if there was some sort of like funny YouTube video or something, I like couldn't wait to show everybody it just because I enjoyed watching their reaction to it. So yeah, I mean the number of times that whether it's Russell Peters or any other like comedy album that's been meaningful to me, that I introduce it to someone and I'm like, they'll even say like, "Oh, I'll just listen to it on my own." I'm like, "No, no, no.
Mhm.
I'll listen to it for the millionth time because I'm excited to like see you react to it."
Yeah, there's something so, personal about that experience where you're
Yeah.
not really watching the thing, you're watching the person watch the thing.
Yes, 100%. I think it's
Oh.
part of the reason that reaction videos are such a big part of our culture
Oh,
now. It's like
yeah.
it's the same phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely, where you're just like, I would watch this person react to, I really enjoy watching people react to, like, really bad reality TV, like, there's a lot of Love Is Blind
Yeah.
reactions
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah.
It's so much fun. My sister and I watched The Bachelor or The Bachelorette with my dad, and I think if we weren't watching with my dad, we would have stopped watching a long time ago. 'Cause, like, half the fun is half the fun is watching him be like, "This is ridiculous. Like, what are you doing?" And watching him get into it, it's so much more fun that way.
Right. But there's who are those kids who is it like something the new trend or something like that? They're like a huge reaction channel. But
Oh,
it's they made fun of it on SNL at one point because increasingly as they get more popular, they've like reacted to everything. So then it's them claiming to be hearing something for the first time where you're like, there's no way you haven't heard this before. They're like, yo, so we heard about this thing called the Star Spangled Banner. I heard it's pretty lit. Let's give it a listen. It's like, you've definitely heard this before.
Right. I have not seen those. I've seen, the one that I have seen the most of is, like it's, like, kids reacting and parents reacting. I don't remember the
Yeah.
name. I think it's Kids React is the name of the
Nice.
channel.
Is that one of those
Um
ones where that makes you feel old, where they're like, "Here's a kid seeing a VCR for the first time," or it's like them listening to music?
No, it's like kids, like, reacting to media. It's mostly, like, very sweet. They're like
Okay,
they just
nice.
it's almost like Kids Say the Darndest Things, that
Right,
old show. Yeah,
right.
it's just very adorable.
I guess the new kids
Um,
say the darndest things is, like the corn kid guy, like he just interviews
yes,
kids all the time.
that TikTok, I
Recess
find
therapy, I think it's called.
yes,
It's
Recess,
really
yeah.
cute.
It's so adorable where you're
Yeah,
like,
it's
"What do
great.
you" oh, kids are so cute. I'm so, like, I don't like kids, but I do think kids are adorable. Do you know what I mean? Like, I want
Yeah, I don't know that I'm gonna have them, but, I love talking to them, and I find
yeah.
them endlessly interesting,
I
as long
don't
as I
want
don't
them
have
in
to
my
take care of
house,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, like, I want you to go home after, but, we can all they say adorable things. Did you do that thing also where, like, you kind of learned comedic timing from repeating jokes from
1,000%.
specials? Yeah?
I was the person and I'm also like I'm pretty good at impressions, and I think part of it was just I don't know how much of it is related to, like, being musical, just, like, being able to
Mm,
hear something and replicate it, but, yeah, I was the person who I've a very good memory and well, it's like a conditional good memory, like, if I care about something, I'll remember every beat of it, and then
yeah.
I'll forget things that I don't care about, but the point is that, I could repeat, like, word for word, intonation for intonation, so many jokes from that album and from many albums, um, and yeah, I think it did kind of subconsciously teach me, like, how to construct a joke or how to say something in a certain tone to elicit that reaction because, like, I didn't major in comedy, you know what I mean? So, like,
Yeah.
my knowledge of comedy, it comes from just listening to it, and then, I guess my own intuition of, like, what I think would be funny.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like a lot of people I know I did, I learned comedic timing from that,
Yeah,
where it was more so you don't realize what you're doing at the time, but it was
yeah,
like I could repeat exactly a Dave Chappelle joke, which I shouldn't have been repeating at the
yeah.
time.
Oh, yeah,
But,
yeah, yeah.
like, and that's how you learn, "Oh, it's funnier when he said it like this than it is
Mhm.
if you had said it like this." And you just start to sort of build that comedy language, I think.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. You know, if you wanna do an experiment, I guarantee if I were to, like, pick a certain joke from that special and recite it to you, it would be, like, beat for beat the exact way that he does it. Like, I it's just it's ingrained in my head.
Do you have a favorite joke from that special?
I think it's the one that he calls back in the end where he talks about how his dad, when he got angry, he would say, "Somebody's gonna get hurt real bad," but he wouldn't be specific about, like, who the somebody was.
Yeah.
So the funny thing about it is like my when I do an Indian accent, I think I'm like literally doing an impression of Russell Peters doing an Indian accent. Like it's so ingrained in my head that I don't even know that it's my own accent. It's like when people do a Harry Carey impression, they're just like doing Will Ferrell doing Harry Carey.
Yeah.
It's like that sort of vibe.
That's so funny. So, did your parents you said your parents were pretty, comedically versed. Did you guys watch that special together?
Oh, yeah. They were, like, some
Yeah.
of the first people that I shared it with, and they loved it, and also, like, a lot of what Russell Peters talks about doesn't really track for me, like, my dad is not the stereotypical Indian dad who's, like, super
Yeah.
strict and beating me and all that, but, like, there are parts of it that definitely track in terms of, us as kids, my sister and I accusing him of, like, being cheap at various times and, kind of some of the kind of the tropes of what Indian parents are like, so they loved it, and then I think similarly, like, they shared it with their whole community of people, and I mean, if you ask the average American, "Do you know who Russell Peters is?" More people than not would say no. If you ask any Indian person, 1000% they know who it is.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think, maybe that was why it was so when you were like, "Yeah, I don't know that he's super, super well known here." I was like, "I mean, I think people know Russell Peters, but that might
He
just be
is,
my
I mean,
own."
don't get me wrong, he can still
Yeah.
do a show at the Garden and sell it out, but in terms of the
Sure.
demographic of who's going, I think it
Yeah.
skews largely Indian, but yeah, did you, and it's okay if you didn't, but did you get a chance to watch the special?
I did, yeah, I watched it, I
Yeah.
think it's only 45 minutes, it's
Yeah.
great if you're
Did you have
listening and you
any
haven't watched that
specials?
special.
Or did you have any,
I
favorite parts?
it's so funny, I also like the end of I think he did a great job with callbacks, like, there,
Yeah, oh
where
my
I
god,
think
yeah.
yeah, because I think the callback is such a, what's the word I'm looking for? The callback is such a specific craft that not everyone can
Mhm.
do, and not being able to
Yeah,
do it doesn't make you a bad comedian, um,
totally.
but he has just a way of managing it where you're like, "Fuck,
Mhm.
that was so funny the first time, and it's funnier now." Like
Well, the whole key with callbacks, and I definitely, use callbacks a lot, is, like, they're more effective in a long set, right? Like, if
Yes.
you when you see a callback in a late night set, it's 5 minutes, so, like, even if it's well constructed, it always feels kind of forced,
Yeah.
because the whole impact of a callback is that you've more or less forgotten about it, and then when someone says it again, you're like, "Oh, shit, that's such
That's
a
right.
great." Yeah, so if you set something up in the first 5 minutes of a 45-minute set, and then 40 minutes goes by and people have forgotten about it, and then you close with a reference to something from the beginning, it's so satisfying when people have forgotten about it, and, like, I just recorded, my second album, and there were two callbacks that I had in there that I both, like, very intentionally set up in the first 10 minutes of the set, because I knew that the more time that had elapsed in between, they would be that much more impactful, and yeah, Peters is great at it, and that closing line where he calls that back about what his dad would say to him is it's incredible.
The other thing I really liked about it was that I think even though the comedy may not be relatable to everyone, like, what he's talking about may not be everyone's lived experience, I think he did
Mhm.
such a good job of making it so that it didn't feel like people outside of that experience would be laughing at that experience, which I think
Totally.
sometimes it's hard to manage that. Like, he does do an Indian accent, and he does kind of
Mhm.
play up some of those, play to some of the stereotypes, but it doesn't feel like someone would watch it and be like, "Ha ha ha." It actually it feels like he does a very good job of not doing jokes that way.
Right. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
also think there's, like, a love that comes through it, like, I know he was
Yeah.
close to his dad, and I always try to do that as well, like, if I'm ever talking about family members or people that are close to me, even if I'm, like, poking fun at them a little bit, I always want it to feel like it's like, in the way that you will playfully, jab at someone who's a friend of yours or who's family, and the other thing about Russell Peters is that he's very equal opportunity with who he makes fun of, which is
Yeah.
everyone. So
Yeah,
I feel
yeah.
like he kind of gets away with it because of that, and sure, I think listening to it now almost 20 years later, there are, like, a handful of things where I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know if that would necessarily fly now," but, By and large, I can still listen to that and be like, "This is an incredible set."
Yeah,
It's really good.
it's really, really good, and it's like I grew up kind of listening to, or watching, uh, like Dave Chappelle and Eddie Murphy and, Chris Rock, and those were sort of what taught me comedy. Um, and you can't say the same thing about their specials. They do not like, if you go back, you're like,
Not Eddie Murphy
"Mm,
raw,
oh, no,
certainly
no."
not that.
It's like you go back and you listen to it and you're like, "Oh, okay." Like, I guess we were
Right.
saying that on stage.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I did really enjoy going back to watch this one and realize, like, most of it holds up. Most of it's still
Mhm.
good, which is cool.
Yeah.
It's a very different experience to watching.
Yeah.
And then it's like, you have the reverse with Chappelle where it's like, "Oh, man, I really wish you would tell some of your old jokes." Now you've
I
decided to
know. Yeah, it bums me
reverse.
out. He's not quite
Yeah.
quite at Kanye level yet, but in terms of, like, someone who is incredibly meaningful to me, who I'm increasingly finding it unable to, enjoy, I feel like
Yeah.
Chappelle's working his way up the ladder more than I would
Yeah,
like him to be.
he's unfortunately, I think, it's hard to compare him to Kanye, but for me, he's gotten there where I'm just like, I can't even, I can't watch anything new. Like, I just know
Yeah,
it's not gonna be worth. I'm gonna be more upset than I
right.
am gonna laugh. You know?
Well, I mean, much like J.K. Rowling, it's a really weird hill to die on.
Yeah, it really is. It's like what, and I think it's interesting too because I think Russell Peters is still doing great comedy and
Mhm.
managing to stay that long. I saw Chris Rock, I guess in 2018 was the tour. It was pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Um, and it was like his first special in a really long time, first tour in a
Mhm.
really long time. And you see a lot of these comedians that are adapting, like they're understanding that the world has changed and therefore
Right.
comedy has to change. And
Mhm.
then you see these other comedians who are almost regressing, where it's like you were like Chappelle was telling some great political comedy. Like Chappelle show had these amazing sketches.
Yeah, absolutely.
That had something to say, and now you're like, why is this it's like watching a legend become a just a sad, sad little. I don't know, I don't even know what the right word is.
Yeah,
Um,
it's weird, and I also think that, the more famous you get and the more your fans adore you, the more you have to be really intentional about, like, still keeping the level of your work as high as it should be,
yeah,
because when you get that famous, people will laugh at almost anything you say, and it's up to you or, you checking in with your peers to be like, "Hey, is this actually a good bit, or are people just laughing because I'm famous?"
right,
And Chris Rock, notoriously, when he's working on a new hour, he'll go to the Comedy Cellar
yeah,
and he will, like, turn it off, basically. He won't do his Chris Rock thing, he won't, like, there's no histrionics, there's no pacing around the stage, it's him just standing there, like, saying the jokes out loud in a fairly deadpan way, just so that he can get an honest reaction of, like, whether or not the material is actually funny, because he knows if he turns that button, people are gonna laugh no matter what he says.
right. Yeah, it's your Chris Rock. I just know how to, like, it's you get
Right.
to a certain level where it's like you cue it's a joke, I laugh,
Mhm.
like, what the guy's funny.
Well, and that's why with Chappelle, like, it feels forced, like,
Mhm,
you can't just smack the microphone on your knee after a shitty joke and expect me to laugh. Like, I know everyone
right.
in the crowd is gonna laugh, but it's just not good.
Yeah, it makes no sense, and it's such an odd. I guess also the thing that bugs me about it the most is I'm like, don't you want to still be funny? Like,
Mhm.
it must hurt inside you as well to I don't know, I think, maybe it's just my own self-consciousness that I feel like
Right.
comedians want to have a genuine laugh from people.
Totally,
Um,
and I mean, now
yeah.
you'll see videos of him on stage with, like, the Foo Fighters or whatever, like, singing a really tone deaf version of Creep, and I'm like, "Oh, you just haven't been told no in the past 15 years." Like, this is
Yeah.
it's very, self-indulgent behavior, I feel.
Yeah, it's wild. It is one of those things where I think it is the length of a career and an extreme
Mhm.
level of fame where it's like maybe we need a cap. Maybe
Right.
there's after a certain time, no more. Just stick with your
Yeah.
old stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, have you kept up with, like, is Russell Peters still a comedian that you still watch and love and adore?
I still I mean, I still I still think he's great. I don't necessarily like keep up with what his new stuff is. Anytime I see his recent work or I see clips, there are times where I'm like, oh, I feel like the well has kind of run dry, just in terms
Mm,
of like there's only so many things you can talk about that pertain to having Indian parents or anything that's more like cultural. But I mean, he's maintained the level that he came in at, and certainly has gotten better. I've actually never even seen him live, believe it or not.
oh, really?
Yeah, I would like to, but I also really don't like seeing comedy in big venues. Like, I feel like it's not what stand up is made for. So the idea of like going to see John Mulaney at the Garden, like, no, I think he's funny, but I don't want to see comedy in that setting. Like, see, I've seen comedy at Carnegie Hall and like bigger venues like that, and that's cool because at least it's a theater. But I just don't feel like comedy is made for an arena. Like, would I do it if I had that kind of following? Sure, it would be incredible, but
Sure.
I still feel like it's just not what comedy was meant to be.
Yeah, I think you have to have a very specific type of comedy to do arenas like that. Like,
Right.
as
Yeah,
much
Kevin
as
Hart is made for arenas.
well, you know what's funny about that actually? I saw Kevin Hart in the smallest room ever, recently
Hmm.
because he was working on new stuff. It was post-COVID, and, there's this comedy club that I will neither endorse nor I won't say the name of it, but there's a comedy club here in North Hollywood that popped up after COVID that I've done comedy at quite a bit, and, I was doing a show there, and one of the bookers was like, hey, there's gonna be a
Hey,
small
get prepared to
yeah.
get bumped.
Yeah, or no, it wasn't even a bump, it was like we were in the main room doing a show, and then they were like, "There's gonna be a small show in the front room," which is like that room that they move smaller shows to. I don't think it holds
Mhm.
more than 50 people. It's a tiny, tiny stage, and it was basically that Kevin had called and wanted to work out new material on in a very small room with an audience as he was kinda, like, getting back into everything. So the booker was like, "Oh, if you want, like, after, I'll save you a seat. You can go in and see it if you come off stage and go over." So I did, and I went with, like, 2 of my friends, and it was Kevin Hart, and, like, I loved watching him work that small room because it was such a different Kevin Hart than I've seen
Right.
before. And he said at the beginning he was I mean, it was like that amazing space you sometimes get to see comedians do where they're working things out and genuinely looking to take notes and adjust and tweak,
That's
and
cool.
it's not polished at all, yeah, and he, like, had his friend in the back and was like after a joke did well, he would be like, "Hey, write that down," or, like, if a joke did poorly, he would be like, "Hey, write this, but put this note down." And he was like calling out
Huh.
his notes to the back of the room.
Yeah.
Um, and the jokes, honestly, I was like, these are so much funnier than what ends up in the special.
Right.
Um, and it was I mean, he said at the top, he was like, I'll probably use 2 jokes from tonight in the final
Mhm.
because most of this I can't tell or I can't like do this on a big stage. But it was almost like a watching someone who has that kind of reputation for being like a Disney star and a big stadium comedian and seeing that like he still has that craft in the core
Mhm.
of him. And I think there's a craft to being like a commercialized version of that too. Like there's still a craft to that comedy, but watching him go all the way down to like literally 30 people and 10 of them seem to work for him. Um and literally just, like, taking notes and adjusting and trying jokes a different way, and then also he got heckled in this tiny
What the
room.
hell?
It was like it was this he said he was, like, not gonna tell a joke. He, like, started a joke and was like, "I don't think I'm gonna do that one tonight," and then this guy was like, "No, do the joke." And we were like, "Whoa, bro," like and he, like, kept going, and Kevin was like, "Dude, no." Like, it was fascinating,
Hmm.
to watch someone that big get heckled in a room so small, where I was like, This is a free like, the tickets were free, like, everything about this is unacceptable, what you're doing," and
Hmm.
to watch him kinda deal with it,
Yeah.
was interesting,
Hmm.
but yeah, I don't know if you've had, like, that experience of getting to see
Oh, yeah, a lot. I mean, because in New York, people will just, like, pop into shows and I've seen, like, Jim Gaffigan on bar shows, like, he'll just, like, drop in and do some new material in front of, like, 15 people. Or, I remember, like, Louis CK coming and doing, like, this show in, like, the back of a dive bar. So that does happen. I mean, people who are like Jerry Seinfeld's level, like, their version of that is, like, dropping into a packed comedy club.
Yeah.
But, yeah, there a lot of comedians who are not as pretentious as Jerry Seinfeld will, they're like, "Yeah, I don't care. I still love comedy. I'm still trying to work stuff out."
Yeah.
Um, Even like Gary Gulman, like, I don't know if you're familiar with
Yeah.
Gulman, but,
Mhm.
he's a pretty huge act now. I mean, he's doing theaters, but he's still, like, bopping around New York when he's working on stuff to do whatever spots he can do.
Yeah, did you I'm so jealous of the New York comedy scene, to be fair, because I
Yeah.
think the LA scene is it's just it's completely different. There's just
Yeah.
a large,
No, New York is better,
oh,
you can say.
yeah, New York, yeah, it is.
For
For stand-up comedy,
comedy,
New York
yes.
is definitely better.
Yes.
And I'm not I love New York, so but did you grow up, like, in New York? Where did you grow up, and how did you end up in New York?
No, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up, well, my the early part of my life was in the Midwest. So my dad's from India, my mom's from Wisconsin. I was born in like the Chicago suburbs,
Mhm,
Aurora. It's like a western suburb of Illinois, or I mean, excuse me, a western suburb of Chicago. Then when I was 10, my dad got a new job, or he like got transferred. So we moved from Illinois to New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. That's where I went to middle school, high school, college.
mhm,
And then after I graduated college and decided that I wanted to like seriously pursue stand up, first few years I was in New Jersey. I was doing stuff like in the local scene there, and then I started touring colleges actually, which is it was weird because like I got into the college touring world before I had even really cut my teeth in New York. So I was like
mm,
still living with my parents and then going on the road doing comedy. And then after a couple of years, I made the move up here, and that's I feel like that's whenever people ask, "How long have you been doing comedy?" I'm like, I'll give you 2 answers. Like, I'll tell you when I first did comedy, and I'll
mhm,
tell you how long I think I've, like, really been doing comedy. And I for me, that clock always starts with me coming to New York because that's when I started, like, doing it almost every day and really taking it seriously in the way that I think you need to really
yeah,
be good at this.
yeah, agreed. Did your parents is your comedy something you share with your parents, or do you not
Mhm.
want them to see you? Yeah?
No, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm more proud of it now than I used to be. Like I remember, I was always happy with them to come to shows, but I feel like in my earlier days when I was doing more like dick jokes, not to put too fine a point on it, like that was always interesting when they were in the audience for that. But I remember even like using that as it's like a cheap laugh, but to
Mm,
tell a dirty joke and then be like, well, I guess I should thank my parents for being here, and then people are like,
yeah.
oh, ha, 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 ha. But
Yeah, I fall victim to that joke as well when my dad comes
yeah,
to my
well, fair
shows.
enough.
It's an easy one.
Yeah.
Um, I always find it interesting when, like, people who tell sort of personal stories and those kinds of jokes can share that experience with people who
Hmm.
may be in the joke, like, or may be in the story.
Right.
Um, and I think, there's almost like a like you said, like, the same way Russell Peters talks about his family and has love for the
Right.
people he's making fun of.
Yeah. I think it's that. I think it's that. And that but there are times where I'll tell a joke that like it was true when I wrote the joke, but it's not true anymore. Like I have a
Mm,
joke that pertains to my dad being cheap and it's based around something that is true, which is that like we used to be on the same cell phone plan and rather than divide the cost of data evenly, he would like go to the Verizon website and look up the exact percentage of data that he used and then calculate the amount to the penny and send that amount to me.
yeah.
And so the whole joke is just about me, like, not understanding why because he's, like, very generous with larger sums of money, but then the
Mm.
smaller it is, somehow it's, like, about principle, and so he'll ask me for, like, $18.31 where I'm like, "You just gave me $1,000 just as a gift, like, I don't understand how this works for you." But, it's funny because when he's heard me do that, he's like, "You should update it and tell them that, like, we don't do that anymore." Like, "Okay, that's fair." I did a show in New Jersey that they were at, a few months ago, and I told the joke, like, the way I wrote it, and then I was like, "Because they're here, I will clarify that we are now, on a different cell phone plan, and I am actually saving money thanks to my parents', senior plan, so all is forgiven." But it's very much like the Russell Peters joke of, just talking about how like Indian dads or Indian parents are incredibly cheap. Like there's the joke where he talks about like his dad is so good at being cheap that he can convince you that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Where the bartender's like, "All right, sir, that'll be 350." Okay, here's three. No, 350. Sir, you owe me 50 cents. Don't worry about it. No, you owe me 50 cents.
Oh, yeah, I love that, like, idea of, like, there's a kernel of truth versus,
Yeah.
there's something very sweet about your dad being like, "I just want you to make sure that they know that that's not it may have been true
Yeah, it was very
once."
sweet.
It's very adorable.
That's my other favorite bit in the Russell Peters sketch is the thing about, about people using Indian slaves, about how he went to South Africa and there were, like, a bunch of Indian people because they had, supposedly been brought there as slaves, but then, like, kind of doing that act out of how bad an Indian person would be
Yeah,
when being,
yeah.
like, asked to do any any amount of manual labor.
Oh, man. Yeah, it is I would tell jokes about my dad a lot, which
Mhm.
I always he's a good sport about it, but a lot of them are, they're conjecture, they're funnier if you phrase them the right
Of
way.
course, yeah.
And I always find it funny when you can find that, like, personal point of view where it's not necessarily true, but if you ask the wrong person, they're gonna be like, "Yeah, it's funny. It's a good joke."
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but I'm
but
also I think I'm also sympathetic to the fact that, like, it's hard for me to take myself out of, like, doing what I do and being on the other side of it, but, like,
Sure.
yeah, it wouldn't be easy to hear yourself being talked about on stage,
Yeah.
and even, like, in relationships I've had or, like, my current relationship now with my girlfriend, like, she's a pretty private person, and she doesn't love the idea of, like, being spoken about, publicly, and so when I do refer to being in a relationship, I try to be very careful about, like, how I talk about it, and also, I, like, run things by her or she'll, like there'll be certain things where she's like, "Yeah, I know that's a joke, and, like, people probably will realize that, but, like, I don't like the idea that someone would think that that's true." And
Yeah.
that's, like, part of the conversation, and I think that's there are some people who just don't give a shit, and they're like, "Yeah, if I don't care, like, this is what the
Yeah,
joke
yeah.
is." But I think if you're someone who values your personal relationships, you have to be, like, a little bit pliable in terms of, hearing people's feedback on what you say, or
Yeah.
also just, like, being proactive about talking it through rather than like, "Oh, I'm gonna do the joke in front of you and then ask your permission later."
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's also there's the danger of it too with, like, John Mulaney is a great example
Mhm,
where you've got so much of a special about your wife, and some of it is probably crafted, and, like, some of it's funny and adjusted, and you try to make a specific joke, but then you go through something very public because of the level of fame you're at, and now people are picking those jokes apart when they
mhm.
were jokes, they were it was,
Well, I mean, I am certainly not John Mulaney, but, like, I have an my first album is, like, all about getting married and, like, being a happy married guy and, like, literally has a photo of my now ex-wife on the album cover, and my second album is about getting divorced, so, like,
Right.
I would assume that if I were at a level of fame where people actually gave a shit, like, I'm sure they would go back and listen to the first one and be like, "Yeah, but, like, I wonder what this actually says about their relationship and, I don't know that it says anything necessarily, but, you are kind of, like, setting yourself up for that. So that is the risk of being personal. Like, it's easier if you're only ever talking about, uh, the kind of food you eat or observations about, like, waiting in line at the airport. No one's gonna go back 5 years from now and be like, "Oh, but, like, what was the subtext of this?" It's like,
Right.
there was no subtext.
Yeah, there's no subtext. It was the yeah, I think there's but I do think, like, it pays off. Like, I'm sure that, that special of being honest and going through it and now having your second, there's something more interesting about that than there is like, I think there's a level of I have to remember the joke to wanna go back and pick it apart anyway,
Mhm,
when you go through and, like, I think Mike Birbiglia does a really good job of that too, where you each I don't know how if you listen to Mike, but
mhm.
he has I feel like each special builds on it, and I remember after the new one being like, "Oh, there are things now that I don't like as much about my girlfriend's boyfriend because I don't know how I feel about this joke or whatever." But the fact that I can quote back and tell you, well, this is the joke that I'm not sure
Right,
still works with this content. Like, okay, it was a good joke. That's why you remember it.
right, right.
Yeah. So I think the other question I have for you is sort of that like it sounds like you went to school and settled on comedy and pretty much pursued it. Like you didn't have a moment where you graduated and thought, "Let me get a quote unquote real job." You went straight to doing comedy. Is that right?
More or less, yeah. I mean, I think the context for that is that I graduated during the first financial crisis, so there were not a lot of jobs to be had anyway.
Yeah.
I graduated from college in 2009, and at that time, I mean, quite literally, the only official job offer I had was to, like, manage a Target because I had gone to one of those, like, career fairs, and I was like, "I guess I'll just talk to whomever so I can practice interviewing." And then I got offered a job to manage a Target, and, the point being that in retrospect, I think if I had graduated at a different time and I had some, like, amazing job opportunity in a different field that I was interested in, I think it would have been a lot harder to be like, "Nah, you know what? I'm gonna pursue comedy and be broke for a long time," and all of that. So, in some ways, I look at it as a blessing in retrospect. But yeah, essentially what happened was I graduated in 2009. By the end of that year, I had gotten really into comedy. I mean, I started my freshman year, and then, like, little by little, it grew, and I started winning some, like, in-state competitions and whatever it was, but enough I was getting enough positive feedback that it started to become clear to me, and people would tell me this of like, "Hey, I think if you want to, like, you might be able to actually do this as a career." But of course, I had no frame of reference for, like, what the mechanics of that would be. So, when I graduated, I decided, like, "Well, I'm gonna pursue this," and I don't really know what that means, but I know that it's gonna take some time to actually make money at it and get really good at it, but I'm, like, open to giving it a shot because I felt like if I didn't do that at the time, there was a bigger chance that if I, like, didn't do it in that moment, I just wouldn't do it, period, and then I
Mhm.
would have to live with not having seen where it could go. So,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, I my mindset was like, well, all I've done for the past 4 years is perform exclusively for the most part at my college. Like I would come up to New York and do bringer shows and stuff, but largely I performed in front of a college audience. So I was like, well, if I am good at performing in front of college students at my college, theoretically I would be good at performing in front of college students at other colleges. And so I was like, that's going to be my focus is I'm going to try to break into the college comedy market. And I did, like, I don't know, I don't wanna say I didn't deserve it because I figured it out, but, like, usually people go and develop an act and they get really good, and then once they, like, have a long set or they have the amount of material you would need to headline, that's when they go and try to do that sort of stuff. For me, it was, like, this very roundabout thing where I didn't even have that much material or experience yet, but I somehow managed to work my way into that market as like a 23-year-old. So I was like barely out of college myself, and I started doing college gigs. And I mean, at the time, I would say I was like operating largely on charisma more than actual like talent or craft. But yeah, so I did that for a few years, and then at a certain point, moved up to New York. Had a complete like existential crisis when I realized that no one knew who I was here, and that performing at college didn't really mean anything in the actual comedy world, and that I
Yeah.
was like pretty shitty. Like, performing in front of college kids does not make you a better comedian. So, all of a sudden performing in front of other comics and doing mics and doing stuff here, it was a pretty jarring slap in the face of like, "Oh, yeah, no one knows who I am. Nothing that I've done at these places, like, matters to anybody here. And so I'm either gonna quit or I'm gonna figure out how to be funny."
Yeah. Did you think about quitting?
Not really. I mean, the weird thing about it was, like, I was already making a living as a comic, which is, like,
Mm.
the goal for so many people just to ever get to that point. But it was like a real, it was an ego hit to some extent. Not that I, like, thought I had made it, but, like, when you come into New York and you're already making money in
Mhm.
comedy, which is, like, the goal that so many people are just trying to get to, um I guess I didn't realize that I would still have to, like, start at the bottom rung, and it like, none of what I was doing outside of New York really mattered to anyone. Now,
Sure.
I don't know how much that would be different now, like, let's say you were someone coming in from elsewhere and you, like, had somewhat of a following online or people had seen your stuff and thought you were funny. Maybe you would be entering at a different fashion, but at the time, I mean, this was, like, 2011, 2012, and
Yeah.
none of that really existed. So it was just kind of that old model of like, yeah, you gotta pay your dues and work your way up and hang out at clubs and hope that somebody notices you and all of that stuff that doesn't really exist anymore, at least not in the same way. And I think there's good and bad to that. But um, yeah, I mean, incredibly long way of saying that I never had a 9 to 5 job. I did odd
Yeah.
jobs. I would like teach tennis lessons and do SAT tutoring, and I worked retail and whatever I needed to do to cobble together enough money in those years before I started making any money doing comedy. But once I
Yeah.
did that, I kind of just parlayed it into everything else. Like I made colleges pay pretty well. So having an Indian dad, I think actually helped me because he was very adamant about being smart with money and saving it. And so I kind of just like kept living like I was broke and saving a ton of money. And I think
Mhm.
that bought me like the next 5 years of my life was just touring for like 2 or 3 years at colleges, making possibly, like, more money than I even make now, but just,
Yeah.
like, putting it all away because I knew that it wasn't gonna last forever.
Yeah. I think that's, maybe the first time I've heard of like,
Of a comedian not
a
being bad with
comedian.
money.
Yeah, or that, and also just, like, being able to kind of put together, like, I totally appreciate the, like, "Oh, it wasn't that funny," but it's still being able to have the forethought and the drive to say, like, "Okay, well, I'm doing well in college crowds now, let me continue to do that and get paid for
Right.
it."
Well, I
There's
mean,
something very, like, forward focused, yeah.
yeah, well, I think that's always been something that I've had going for me is that comedians, I mean, this is a generalization, but, like, a lot of comedians are, like, kind of a mess personally, and they're not great at the business side of things, and they have this attitude of, like, "Yeah, I'm just gonna be funny," and, like, hopefully the industry notices and, like, someone will point at me and be like, "Hey, you're great. You're famous now."
Yeah.
And I think, especially because of social media, that's not, you can't do that anymore. You can't be that
Mhm.
complacent. But at the time, even as a 21, 22-year-old, I think I had like a good sense of that side of it. And I knew how to present myself a certain way. And like, that's what I had gone to school for was, I mean, I joked about it before, but I had like a communications degree with a focus in PR and mass communication. And so, essentially I like approached it as if I was the business, and I was like, "How do I if I were gonna convince someone that I am whoever, like, how
Mhm.
would I go about doing that?" And so I it was almost like making a PR campaign for myself, and,
Yeah.
I've been chasing that level of unfounded confidence ever since.
So you're trying to tell me that getting a comedy major wouldn't help you become a working comedian?
Well, perhaps getting a comedy major would set you up for a career in communications, who can say? Maybe it's like
You
a
never know.
reversal, yeah.
I could see that actually. Um, yeah, no, I think that's really cool is to be able to like you're saying, like I think sometimes just being in any creative field, not even just comedy.
Mhm,
I think especially comedy because it's set up in a way that you're working at night in clubs with people drinking and doing all sorts of things, and it's easy to sort of lose sight of the fact that you're trying to make this a job
mhm,
or to make it a career with sustainability. Um, but it is something that I think, like, creative they don't really teach you I can't think of one film class I took at film school that
mhm.
taught me, like, I remember graduating and my dad was like, "So, like, what can you expect to make?" I was like, "Mm, I don't know." But,
Right.
you're implying that I'm gonna make anything,
Mhm.
which it seems bold, but I think, but, I think there is, like, that gap almost in both, like, education and also just, like, culture of creative work and comedic work of, like,
Mhm.
there is you like you said, you are the business, like, how are you marketing it? How are you getting yourself in front of people?
Right.
And there's something to that being it almost doesn't matter how funny you are if you can't do that part of it as well.
Right, and you also have to have both. I mean, I think there are people
Yeah.
that I've known, in my time in comedy who are, like, so business oriented that they don't make enough time to actually have an act, and they're
Yeah.
so busy, like, self-promoting and, like, putting out this vibe of, like, how great they are that then when you actually see them, you're like, "Oh, well, you've managed to sell tickets to a thing, but I don't know that these people are gonna buy tickets again because 'cause you're just not that good." So,
Mhm.
I think ideally you wanna have some of both, and of course, like, the more successful you get, like, it's not like Kevin Hart is doing his own PR, he's got a team of people to do
Yeah.
that, but, that doesn't come until a long way into your career, and even personally, like, I'm at a stage in my career where I have, like, a lot of agents and, like, reps for various things, but I still find myself, like, doing more for myself than anyone else is gonna do, 'cause I think
Mhm.
that's almost always that way until you're at, like, a completely different stratosphere of fame.
Yeah. Yeah, and then even when you are at that stratosphere, like, you look at I think again, I don't know why I'm so pro Kevin Hart today, but Kevin Hart's a great example of that,
Yeah.
where you look at, like, he's gone past if you just let someone manage your career, I'm sure he would have continued to do great, with movies and stadium tours, but you also have, like, someone who still has the drive to be like, "Let me go do a small room of 30 people and
Right.
get heckled by someone who doesn't deserve to heckle me,"
Mhm.
or and also, like, he's done a lot with, with investments and starting, like, other businesses and investing in other people. I think, like, when you look at those massively successful people, they usually still have that same drive of what you're talking about before
Right.
of having that kind of, "I wanna do this, and I'm gonna do it the right
Mhm.
way." Uh, Energy. Well, we could find out later that Kevin Hart himself is a terrible person, and I've, spent an hour talking about how much I love him.
I'm sure it'll happen at some point.
One day we'll find out.
Yeah. One day we'll
Mm,
all we'll all find out that we're all bad people.
yeah, you never know. Being people is no, I actually it's always so funny when we talk about these things. I think we've talked a lot today about comedians that comedians by nature are going to have a joke that was funny back then, isn't funny now, shouldn't have
Mhm.
been said, etc. But I always kind of come back to Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett wrote a book called Good Omens, and there's a quote towards the beginning of the book where they say it's important to this is not word for word, but basically it's important to realize that the things that happen in this book happened not because people are fundamentally good or fundamentally bad, but because people are fundamentally people.
Hmm.
And I always come back to that when I think about things like this, where, like, any sort of performance, you're kind of building a character, you're building um, kind of a separation of who you are and who you're performing as.
Right.
And a lot of times, especially with comedy, those things are very close to each other. But like we said with John Mulaney, or you mentioned with your own special of going from fun married guy to divorced guy, like, those things, the reason why they're enjoyable is because there's a humanity to it. So it's always nice to remember that, like, if a person wasn't flawed, they wouldn't have been funny in the first place for you to now put them on this stage of being upset that
Right.
they are human.
Yeah, and I also I think that, like, that context is important, I think if,
Yeah.
yeah, like, when you go back and watch Eddie Murphy's special, it's hard to watch, there's no other way to
Yeah.
say it, but,
Yeah.
I also think that's a different thing than if Eddie Murphy in 2022 was still saying, like, "Yeah, I believe all of those things."
Exactly. Yeah.
I think there should at least be the opportunity for personal growth for people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think again, like, it's like I said with, like, Chris Rock, like, seeing someone make that adjustment,
Mhm.
that's all you can really hope for. I mean, obviously, you can hope that nobody ever says anything bad, but it's not a
Yeah.
realistic
No.
situation. But to see someone go from when they have a level of him that they don't have to do it, to be able to say, like, "Okay, well, those jokes aren't funny anymore. Let me learn more and work with younger comedians and, direct comedian specials that are more on the pulse of what's going on culturally,
Mhm.
and adjust my comedy, before I come back." Like, I think that's what you can really want and ask for from someone like that.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
Um, well, we've talked quite a bit about comedy and the craft, and I've had a really fun time with it. So I think
Yeah, me
I
too.
am gonna ask you. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for joining me on it.
Of
I
course.
think I always have fun talking about comedy with other comedians because I think people like I was saying, like, talking to my friends who prefer improv, like, there is so much that, like, it really is like a science of sitting there like a person, and all you get at the end is hopefully a laugh. Like, there's
Right.
no life-changing experience, but it's always fun to talk about that with someone
Yeah.
who has thoughts, and you've done it far more successfully than I have, so it's
Wow.
always a good time. But I am gonna ask you the last question that I ask everybody, which is,
Yeah.
if you had never seen Russell Peters' special, what would be different about you today?
There's no way to really be sure, but I think it was one of the things that was like a very early catalyst in making comedy seem like something that was accessible to me in a way that it hadn't been before. Like
Mm,
I can't sit here and say, oh, if I had never heard that, I just never would have become a comedian. Like there,
yeah.
I wonder that often, like even in terms of growing up in Illinois and then moving to New Jersey, and then of course you're like around a different group of people. I have those thoughts of like, is there some like other version of me in some alternate timeline where I didn't leave Illinois and I didn't meet the same people and I just never like went this path.
Mhm,
I don't know, but I think hearing this special at the time where when I think of the things that are most meaningful to me in terms of my sense of comedy and like what I think is funny, they all come from that period of time. And I don't know why
mm,
that is, but when I think of like junior, senior year of high school, which of course is like a formative time anyway, um, it also coincided with me, I was, like, pretty overweight and, like, losing a lot of weight, and it was a time where I, like, was kind of coming into my own and starting to build some confidence in a way that I hadn't had before, and it all converged where, like, in the same year, I'm, like, hearing Russell Peters for the first time, I'm getting introduced to Chappelle's show, like, The Office is exploding as, like, the biggest show
mm,
on television, and all of these different pieces of information are entering my brain at a time that was really important and, like, kind of unconsciously, forming my idea of, like, what I think is funny, and, yeah, so I don't know, I don't have an answer. I don't know that anyone probably has a definite answer when you ask them that
yeah.
at the end of these, but, I think it's entirely possible that I would not have been as, inclined to pursue stand-up at the time that I did, because it made it feel like, "Oh, this is someone who's talking about stuff that sounds like stuff in my life."
Mm,
And even if I could listen to Dave Chappelle or listen to Jerry Seinfeld or Chris Rock or Dane Cook or whoever it was at the time, like, yeah, it was funny, but none of it sounded like stuff that I had lived. And so
yeah.
I think this was the first time that I heard something like that, and I think that, like, was super impactful.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I don't think anybody has like a definite if I had never seen this, I would never have become blah blah blah. But I think
Right.
there's something that you talked about there, which I really like, is this idea of that period of time just maybe defining what you think is funny,
Mhm.
and what was happening at the time. And it sounds like this was maybe like the last kernel of okay, all of these things are very funny to me, and here's someone who also has something very specifically relatable
Yeah,
that makes me
totally.
go, "Yeah." So, I think that's cool. It doesn't have to be, I think it'd be pretty wild if you could say, like, "Well, if I had never seen that special, there's no way I'd be funny in life."
Yeah.
Like,
I would
but,
I would be a I would be a gastroenterologist in Toronto if
yeah.
I hadn't seen that.
Oh, wouldn't
I
we
just
all like
know,
to
yeah.
be, you know? Yeah, but it's interesting to me always, like, when there's that one it's sort of
Mhm.
like the last thing that goes in the blender, right? That, like,
Yeah.
makes it work.
Yeah, and there's something I think there's really something, special about the fact that I don't remember the last time I've watched that special, but, like, that stuff is seared in my brain. Like,
Mm,
I will, 40 years from now, I will still be able to, like, quote lines from that just because it meant that much to me at the time, and I watched it so many times that, like, I even if I never watch it again, it's just in there somewhere.
yeah. Yeah. Ugh, I love that.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today and having, like, a really fun conversation about comedy.
of course.
And I had a great time. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kamari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.